A woman didn't show up for Mass on Sunday morning, and by Monday her family was worried. Kate Blackburn had never missed church without calling someone. She kept to a strict routine, one her neighbors could set their watches by. But on September 13th, 1964, that routine was shattered. Right from the start, detectives hit a wall. The evidence at the scene was both horrifying and puzzling, pointing to a killer who had spent hours inside Kate's home, yet left behind almost no useful leads. When her niece discovered the body, it launched one of Albany's most disturbing investigations. The truth wouldn't come out for over 6 decades. When detectives finally uncovered the killer's identity in 2025, it was through technology that didn't exist when Kate died, and the revelation brought closure to a family that had spent 61 years waiting for answers. The investigation would drag on through generations, becoming a case that haunted veteran detectives for the rest of their careers, a mystery that seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. Before we dive into this shocking story, if you're fascinated by cold cases that took decades to solve, cases where justice seemed impossible until science and determination proved everyone wrong, hit that subscribe button right now. This is a story about a killer who thought time was his ally. Also, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Catherine Kate Beck was born on March 1st, 1914 in Albany, New York, to Polish-born parents. She was one of 7 children, with 1 brother and 5 sisters. The Becks were a deeply religious Catholic family, attending Mass regularly and centering their lives around their faith. Kate's devotion to Catholicism would remain a defining feature of her entire life, influencing every major decision she would make. She grew up as a responsible, hard-working young woman with strong family values. Kate was known among her siblings for being reliable and organized, someone who took her commitments seriously. She maintained close relationships with her sisters throughout her life, speaking with them regularly and involving herself in the lives of their children. Despite her deep religious convictions, when Kate got married, it was not in a church ceremony. On July 3, 1938, 24-year-old Kate married Jesse Blackburn in a City Hall ceremony. Jesse had been married previously, which meant they could not be married in the Catholic Church. While Kate could not enter into her marriage in accordance with her religious beliefs, those same beliefs would keep her in it, even when the relationship fell apart almost immediately. Kate and Jesse only lived together as husband and wife for a very short period of time. Jesse served in the United States Army Air Force, which meant he had to move around frequently, both overseas and to various bases on the West Coast, depending on where he was stationed. Kate was not interested in leaving her life in Albany and her family behind. She had deep roots in the community and couldn't imagine starting over somewhere else, following a man from base to base with no stability. Furthermore, based on letters they exchanged over the years, the responsible and regimented Kate quickly grew frustrated with how unreliable and irresponsible her husband was. Jesse struggled with money, made impulsive decisions, and seemed to lack the discipline that Kate valued so highly. However, while they lived separate lives on opposite sides of the country, the couple did not divorce. Doing so was completely against Kate's religious beliefs, and she took her marriage vows seriously even though the marriage itself had essentially ended. They maintained a cordial relationship, periodically exchanging letters, although Kate would also sometimes receive letters from the various girlfriends Jesse had over the years. Rather than causing dramatic confrontations, Kate simply accepted this as part of her situation. She would even wire Jesse money if he needed it, which he often did, despite their separation. Once his service in the Air Force ended, Jesse took a civilian job working for the Army, which eventually led to him moving to Japan, putting an entire ocean between them. Kate built a life for herself in Albany entirely separate from her estranged husband. She was employed for 30 years at the Mohawk Brush Company, where she worked her way up through the ranks. Through dedication and strong work ethic, she eventually became a forewoman, supervising other employees and earning the respect of her co-workers. Kate was known at the factory as someone who took her job seriously, showed up on time every single day, and treated everyone fairly. Kate saved her money carefully, and in time was able to purchase her own home. She bought a 2-family house at 117 Colony Street in Albany, living on the first floor and renting out the upstairs apartment to supplement her income. The rental income helped make her financial situation more comfortable and gave her additional security. She took pride in maintaining the property and being a good landlord. By 1964, when Kate was 50 years old, she had created a stable, orderly life for herself. She was well liked by her neighbors, who knew her as a kind but fairly private person. She was always polite and would exchange pleasantries, but she didn't share the intimate details of her personal life with many people. She was also known throughout her neighborhood for sticking to a very strict routine, one that her neighbors could predict with remarkable accuracy. Every Saturday she swept her front porch. Every Sunday she attended the 6 a.m. Mass at St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church without fail. Every Sunday afternoon she hung her laundry outside to dry and burned her trash. Her daily life followed patterns that brought her comfort and structure. On Saturday, September 12, 1964, 50-year-old Kate worked half a day at the Mohawk Brush Company factory, as she did most Saturdays. She arrived home around noon, parking her car and entering her first-floor apartment. The day seemed entirely normal. Kate went about her usual Saturday routine, taking care of household tasks and preparing for the week ahead. Between 5 and 6:20 p.m. on September 12th, several neighbors saw Kate outside sweeping her front porch, exactly as she did every Saturday evening. She appeared to be in good spirits, and everything seemed routine. They exchanged waves and brief hellos. This would be the last time anyone saw Kate Blackburn alive. The last time Kate spoke to anyone would be a short time later, in the early evening, when she talked to one of her sisters over the phone. Her sister had wanted to bring Kate some food for dinner, but Kate politely declined the offer. She told her sister that a tenant was coming to see the apartment. It wasn't entirely clear if Kate meant that the man who had already paid a deposit to move in was coming to see the apartment again before the October 1st move-in date, or if she was showing the apartment to someone else who was interested in renting it. Kate attended the 6 a.m. Mass at St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church every Sunday morning without fail. Her attendance was so reliable that other regular churchgoers would have noticed immediately if she wasn't there. On Sunday, September 13th, however, Kate was not at the service. The pews where she normally sat remained empty. When she also didn't attend the 8 a.m. Mass, it became even more unusual. Later in the day on Sunday, neighbors noticed that Kate never came outside to do her normal Sunday chores. She didn't hang her laundry out to dry on the clothes line in her yard. She didn't burn her trash in the barrel she kept for that purpose. For a woman who lived by such a predictable schedule, these absences were deeply out of character. But no one raised an alarm just yet. Kate was driven to and from work every day by her friend Marie Hogan. It was an arrangement that had been in place for some time, and Marie relied on Kate to be ready and waiting when she arrived. When Marie pulled up to the Colony Street house on the morning of Monday, September 14th, however, Kate did not come outside to get in the car. Marie waited, thinking perhaps Kate was running a few minutes late, but after several minutes passed, she became concerned. Marie got out of her car and walked up to Kate's door. She knocked repeatedly, but Kate did not answer. Marie tried calling out Kate's name, but there was no response from inside the house. The curtains were drawn and Marie couldn't see anything through the windows. Growing increasingly worried, Marie decided to reach out to Kate's family. Marie contacted Kate's 19-year-old niece, Sandy. Sandy had some time before she had to start work that day, so she decided to go over to her Aunt Kate's house to check on her. She knew how unusual it was for her aunt to deviate from her normal routine. Something had to be wrong. Sandy asked her younger, sister Marianne, to go with her, but Marianne said no because she had to get to school. She had just started the 10th grade and couldn't miss class. Sandy then asked her Aunt Anna, another one of Kate's sisters, to go to the house on Colony Street with her. The two women arrived at Kate's home around mid-morning. Sandy knocked firmly on the door, but like Marie earlier, got no answer. She called out for her aunt, but heard nothing from inside. Sandy began tossing pebbles at various windows, hoping to get Kate's attention in whatever room she might be in. There was still no answer. Sandy and Anna walked around the property, trying to figure out what to do next. That's when they realized they could get inside through the unlocked cellar door. They went down into the basement and up the stairs into the shared foyer. The foyer served both Kate's first-floor apartment and the stairs that led to the upstairs rental unit. The door to Kate's part of the house was unlocked. Sandy and Anna were able to get inside without any difficulty. They called out Kate's name again as they entered, but received no response. Kate was not anywhere on the first floor of the house. She wasn't in her bedroom, the kitchen, the living room, or the bathroom. They searched each room carefully, calling her name, but she didn't answer. Initially, nothing seemed out of place anywhere on the first floor. There were no signs of a struggle, nothing obviously missing, No indication that anything was wrong. Kate had told multiple people in her life that she would be painting the upstairs apartment in preparation for a new tenant moving in on October the 1st. Sandy and Anna decided to check the upstairs unit, thinking perhaps Kate had started working on preparing it, and something had happened to her up there. They climbed the stairs to the second floor. When they reached the top of the staircase, they saw that the front door of the upstairs apartment was standing open. They also saw Kate lying on the floor of the unit's living room. Even from the doorway, they could tell something was terribly wrong. They ran to call an ambulance, desperately hoping their aunt could still be helped. When the ambulance arrived and the paramedics entered the apartment, they immediately called the police. They told Anna and Sandy that there had been a homicide. Kate Blackburn was dead, and she had clearly been murdered. Kate's body was found in the living room of the upstairs unit, but that was not where she had been killed. Blood evidence at the scene indicated that she had initially been attacked in an entryway between the upstairs unit's kitchen and back bedroom. The blood patterns told investigators that the initial assault had taken place there, and the body had been moved afterward. She had been struck on the back of her head multiple times with tremendous force, resulting in skull fractures. The blows had been delivered with such violence that several of Kate's fingers were broken. Investigators believed she had instinctively grabbed the back of her head after the first strike, trying to protect herself, and her fingers had been caught between the weapon and her skull during the next blow. The medical examiner determined that Kate had been struck at least 7 times in the head. The weapon used to inflict the head wounds appeared to be a small hammer or meat tenderizer. Investigators believed the killer may have taken it from Kate's own kitchen without her noticing, possibly while she was getting the keys to the upstairs apartment from the lockbox in her bedroom where she kept them. After Kate was incapacitated or unconscious from the blows to her head and lying face down on the kitchen floor, the killer made the first of what would be numerous trips between the house's 2 apartments. He went downstairs to Kate's apartment and selected one of her kitchen knives from the drawer. He then returned to the upstairs unit where he turned Kate over onto her back. The killer stabbed her once in the left side of her neck and once on the front of it. The second stab wound cut her carotid artery, and Kate bled to death rapidly. The amount of blood at the scene was massive, far more than the killer appeared to have anticipated. Police immediately secured the crime scene and began processing the evidence. What they found painted a disturbing picture of a killer who had spent considerable time in Kate's home, both before and after murdering her. The level of planning and the bizarre ritualistic elements of the crime made it unlike anything Albany detectives had encountered before. The killer had gone downstairs after the murder and broken into a cedar hope chest in Kate's apartment to retrieve a white linen sheet. He also brought up 2 pillows from Kate's bed. It appeared that he had not anticipated the massive amount of blood his crime would create. He attempted to drag Kate's body into the living room, leaving a trail of blood through the apartment. He tried to clean up the large pool of blood left in the spot where he had actually killed her, using the sheet and other materials. Ultimately, he gave up on the cleanup effort and left the sheet near the large amount of remaining blood. So much blood had pooled on the floor that it eventually began seeping through the floorboards and into the downstairs apartment where Kate had lived. After police concluded their investigation and released the scene, the task of actually cleaning up the blood would be undertaken by Kate's nieces, Sandy and Teresa. While it was an upsetting and traumatic task for both of them, they both wanted to spare their mothers the horror of seeing so much of their sister's blood covering the floors and walls. What detectives discovered next made the case even more disturbing. The killer had pushed up Kate's long brown dress and full-length petticoat so that they bunched around her neck and shoulders. He had cut away her bra with a knife. Then, in what would become one of the most bizarre and horrifying aspects of the case, he used heated knives to burn intricate lines that formed shapes on Kate's breasts and around her lips. There was no electricity in the upstairs apartment at the time, so investigators believed the killer had made multiple trips downstairs to Kate's apartment. He would place Kate's own kitchen knives in the burner flames of her gas stove to heat them to the point where they could be used to mutilate her body in this manner. The burns formed deliberate patterns, suggesting this wasn't random violence but something the killer had thought about and planned. When he was done with this grotesque ritual, the knives were left under the stove cover in Kate's downstairs kitchen. The medical examiner's findings confirmed what detectives suspected from the scene. The killer had also raped Kate's body after her death, leaving behind seminal fluid. This evidence would become critically important decades later, though in 1964, The technology to fully analyze it did not yet exist. Detectives began interviewing everyone who knew Kate, starting with her family and friends. They spoke with her sisters, her nieces and nephews, her neighbors, and her co-workers at the Mohawk Brush Company. Everyone painted the same picture of Kate, a kind, hard-working, deeply religious woman who kept to herself and had no enemies. No one could imagine why anyone would want to hurt her, much less murder her in such a brutal and degrading manner. More than 300 people attended Kate's funeral mass at St. Joseph's Church, where she had worshipped faithfully every Sunday, and her interment at St. Agnes Cemetery. More than 100 of the mourners were co-workers of Kate's at the Mohawk Brush Company. The factory management had given all employees the day off specifically to attend the services, a testament to how respected and beloved Kate had been. 11 of Kate's co-workers served as either honorary or actual pallbearers, carrying her casket. Police closely monitored the ceremony, a standard investigative technique. Detectives watched the crowd at the burial from across the street, looking for anyone who seemed out of place or whose behavior raised suspicions. They even placed a microphone in Kate's casket, hoping to capture any revealing conversations or confessions from a guilt-ridden killer paying final respects. Kate's distraught family struggled to comprehend what had happened. They were shocked that someone could hurt Kate at all, much less in such an abhorrent manner. Several of her loved ones were hysterical at her funeral, barely able to stand as they said goodbye. The grief was compounded by the complete senselessness of the crime. Kate had harmed no one. She had lived a quiet, simple life. Why would anyone do this to her? At the funeral service, the family also became aware that Kate had been keeping a significant secret from them for quite a long time. She had been in a long-term relationship for the past 16 years with a man none of them had ever met. Kate had met Ben Maskin in 1948 when she was 34 years old. Ben had previously survived polio as a child. While he was still able to walk following his recovery, he did so with great difficulty, often needing assistance. He sold produce for a living and lived with his mother, never having married. According to Ben, he and Kate had fallen in love shortly after they met, but their relationship had progressed very slowly because Kate still took her marriage vows seriously, despite her long separation from her husband, Jesse. Being involved with a man who was not her husband in any manner went against Kate's religious beliefs. She was still legally married, even though she and Jesse hadn't lived together in decades. Divorce was absolutely out of the question for Kate. It violated fundamental Catholic doctrine. But so did having a romantic relationship with another man while still married. Kate found herself caught between her heart and her faith. Further complicating their relationship was the fact that Kate was Polish and Catholic while Ben was Jewish. In that time and in their community, a relationship that crossed these cultural and religious lines was still somewhat unconventional and would have raised eyebrows. People talked, and Kate was intensely private about her personal life. A few of Kate's close friends knew about her relationship with Ben, but Kate could not bring herself to tell her family about him. Her relationship with him went against her religious principles, and she knew it. Kate was very close with her family, and their opinions mattered deeply to her. The thought of disappointing them or being judged by them was more than she could bear. So she kept Ben hidden, living two separate lives. While she didn't feel as though she could disclose her relationship with Ben to her family directly, it does appear that Kate wanted him to get to know her loved ones in whatever limited capacity she could arrange. When Kate's niece and goddaughter Sandy was working at a Carvel ice cream stand as a teenager, Kate and Ben would park some distance away from it so they could watch Sandy work without being seen together. Kate would send Ben up to the counter to order ice cream so that he could meet Sandy, even though Sandy would have no idea who he really was and would just think he was a regular customer. It was Kate's way of connecting the two parts of her life without actually revealing the truth. Ben would chat briefly with Sandy, then return to the car where Kate waited out of sight. Ben was interviewed extensively by police immediately after Kate's murder, and he fully cooperated with the investigation from the very beginning. It was clear to detectives that he cared for Kate dearly, and he was absolutely heartbroken over her death. His grief appeared genuine and overwhelming. Ben provided police with a detailed account of his activities during the relevant time period. On Saturday, September 12th, the day Kate was last seen alive, he had spent most of the day at a local restaurant playing card games with a group of friends. Multiple people confirmed his presence there throughout the afternoon and into the evening. He had tried coming over to see Kate late that Saturday evening, but she had not answered the door when he knocked. This was unusual, but he thought perhaps she had gone to bed early. He came back to try to see Kate the following day, Sunday, after she should have returned home from morning mass. Again, she did not answer the door like she normally would. Ben waited in the neighborhood throughout the day, walking past her house multiple times and sitting in his car nearby, hoping to spot her. He never saw her, and growing increasingly concerned, he tried calling her approximately 10 times between Saturday and when her body was discovered on Monday morning. The phone rang and rang with no answer, which greatly concerned him. Kate always answered her phone if she was home. Detectives verified Ben's alibi thoroughly. The friends he had been playing cards with confirmed his presence at the restaurant. There were no gaps in his timeline that would have allowed him to commit the murder. He also had no scratches or bruises on him, something that would have been almost impossible to avoid given the violent struggle that had taken place and the defensive injuries Kate had sustained. Additionally, everyone who knew about Ben and Kate's relationship confirmed that they cared deeply for each other, and that Ben had been nothing but kind and patient with Kate for years. Detectives definitively ruled him out as a suspect. However, Ben was able to provide additional information about something police already believed might be connected to Kate's murder. The fact that she was preparing to rent out her upstairs apartment to a new tenant. Kate had the same family as tenants in her upstairs apartment for many years. They had been reliable, quiet tenants who paid their rent on time and took good care of the space. However, they had been forced to move out earlier in 1964 due to a death in the family that required them to relocate. Kate needed to find a new tenant to replace the income she relied on from the rental. Kate began advertising the apartment in the Knickerbocker News newspaper in July of 1964. The ad ran for several weeks, and the final time it appeared in the paper was on September 4th, just over a week before Kate was killed. Kate had told various people in her life that she had found a new tenant and that she would be painting the apartment and doing other maintenance tasks to prepare for them moving in on October 1st. According to Ben Maskin, however, Kate was wary of the man who had paid a $10 deposit to secure the apartment. She had described the new tenant to family members as a short man in his 50s. He had told Kate that he and his mother would be moving into the apartment together. While Kate had accepted his deposit, she had started second-guessing her decision to rent to him. Kate mentioned to Ben that the man had smelled strongly of alcohol when he had come to see the apartment, which concerned her. She worried about having a tenant with a drinking problem. Additionally, something about the address he had given her didn't sit right with Kate. He had claimed to live at 369 2nd Avenue, which was located in a nicer section of Albany, an area with larger homes and a more affluent population. Kate found the idea of this man and his mother moving from a more desirable neighborhood into her working-class area suspicious. Why would they move from a better neighborhood to a worse one? The rent Kate was charging wasn't particularly low. Something about his story just didn't add up, and Kate's instincts were telling her to be careful. On the night of Wednesday, September 9th, 3 days before she was killed, Kate's suspicions had grown strong enough that she asked Ben to drive her over to 2nd Avenue to see the house at the address the new tenant had given her. She wanted to verify that the address was real, and perhaps get a sense of whether his story made sense. They drove to the area that evening, but it was too dark for Kate and Ben to clearly see the house numbers and determine which specific house was number 369. Unable to confirm or disprove the man's story in the darkness, they drove back to Kate's house. Ben left later in the evening after spending some time with Kate. He never saw Kate alive again. 3 days later, she would be dead. No one ever came forward identifying themselves as the man who had paid Kate the $10 deposit to move in on October 1st. No one contacted Kate's family after her death, claiming to have been the prospective tenant or asking about the apartment. This solidified the concerns initially raised by Kate herself. Something had definitely been off with the potential tenant, and now he had vanished completely. The last known contact anyone had with Kate seemed to confirm that renting out the apartment was what had brought her killer into her house. Kate had spoken to her sister on the phone in the early evening of September 12th, just hours before she was likely murdered. Her sister had wanted to bring Kate some food for dinner, but Kate told her no because, as she said, a tenant was coming to see the apartment. A scrap of paper with 117 written on it, the same number as Kate's house number, was found outside the house on Colony Street. This led detectives to speculate that someone may have come looking for Kate's house, knowing the house number but not being familiar with exactly which house it was or what it looked like. Perhaps they had written the number down to make sure they found the right address. If you're still here, I really appreciate you. Kindly comment the exact time you are watching this in the comment section. Kate's downstairs apartment was for the most part left untouched by her killer, with a few critical exceptions. He had broken into the Cedar Hope chest to find a sheet to use in his attempted cleanup. He had taken knives from her kitchen drawer to use in the murder. He had used her stove to heat those knives for the mutilation of her body. But he hadn't ransacked the apartment looking for valuables. He hadn't stolen her purse or jewelry. This wasn't a robbery. However, there was one item the killer had specifically looked for and taken part of, and it supported the theory that Kate had been killed by the man who had previously paid her the deposit. Kate kept a rent receipt book in a hutch in her living room. It was a standard practice for landlords. She would fill out a slip of paper when she was paid rent or a deposit, recording the date, amount, and the name of the person who paid. The stub would remain in the book so that Kate would have a permanent record of all payments, and she would tear out a receipt to give to the person who had paid her. The killer had gone through the hutch and found the receipt book. Detectives discovered that the last page of the book that had been written on, along with the 4 pages behind it, including the stubs that were designed to remain in the book as Kate's records, had been torn out and taken. Every single page with any trace of the most recent transaction was gone. Police believed that the killer's name had been written in that book by Kate when she received the deposit, and that he had taken the pages so that he could not be identified through her records. It was a calculated move that showed planning and awareness of evidence. He knew his name was in that book, and he knew he had to remove it. However, the killer had not anticipated the science of document examination. Even though the pages were gone, experts were still able to detect the faint impressions left on the paper underneath by the pressure of Kate's pen writing on the pages above. Through careful indented writing analysis, they could make out most of what Kate had written. The name on the receipt for the $10 deposit appeared to be Robert Broadhead, or something very similar to that. Various experts who examined the receipt book under different lighting conditions and using different techniques were confident that the first name was Robert. They could see the distinctive curves and lines that formed those letters clearly enough. However, they could not be as certain about the last name. The handwriting was more difficult to read in the surname section. Other possible last names provided by various experts who examined the impressions included Brand, Brandt, Boardhead, and Broadstead. The experts were also able to determine that the address listed on the receipt was 316 2nd Avenue, the same address Ben Marskin had provided to them when he described attempting to go there with Kate to check out the new tenant's claim of living there a few days before she was killed. Detectives launched an exhaustive investigation into every man with a name that could possibly match the one Kate had written in her receipt book. They tracked down every Robert Broadhead, Robert Brand, Robert Brandt, and every variation they could think of in Albany and the surrounding areas. They investigated each one, looking into their backgrounds, whereabouts on September 12th, and any possible connection to Kate. None of them could be connected to the case. As best as investigators could determine, the man had provided Kate with a false name. Police also investigated the people living at 369 2nd Avenue, the address the man had given Kate. The residents there had never heard of anyone named Robert with any of the possible last names. They had no connection to Kate, had never tried to rent an apartment from her, and had no idea why someone would use their address. Detectives even expanded their search to investigate people living in houses with the number 369 on other streets throughout Albany, thinking perhaps Kate had misheard or miswritten the street name. None of these leads went anywhere. Investigators did not limit their potential suspects to just men matching the description Kate had provided of the man who had put down the $10 deposit. The short man in his 50s who wanted to move in with his mother. This description had come secondhand from Kate's family members who she had spoken to about the tenant. It was possible that Kate had shown the apartment to multiple people and that her family members had confused the new tenant with another man who had come to see the apartment at a different time. Information about Kate's murder was shared with police departments in several states. Detectives traveled as far as Connecticut to follow up on leads about suspicious potential renters. A woman in Connecticut had called Albany police to tell them about a man who had called her asking to see an apartment she was advertising for rent. She thought the man sounded suspicious and creepy over the phone, and interestingly, he had told her he was renting the apartment for himself and his mother. The exact same story Kate's prospective tenant had used. Albany police coordinated with Connecticut authorities and were actually waiting for the man when he arrived to tour the apartment in Connecticut. They questioned him extensively about his background, his whereabouts in mid-September, and whether he had any connection to Albany or to Kate Blackburn. While he had been dishonest with the landlady about certain details, he turned out to have a legitimate explanation. He had just been uneasy about speaking openly with the woman because he was actually renting the apartment for himself and his girlfriend, not his mother, and he was worried about judgment. His alibi for September 12th checked out completely. Despite the best efforts of the Albany Police Department, time went on and no arrests were made in the case. Detectives kept working it, following up on every tip that came in, but the leads kept fizzling out. They collected DNA samples from numerous men who had known Kate or who had come to see the apartment, but the technology to create comprehensive DNA profiles from the evidence at the scene didn't exist yet in the 1960s. They could preserve the evidence, but they couldn't fully analyze it. The case began to grow cold. Months turned into years. Detectives who had worked the case retired, and new detectives would occasionally review the files, but no breakthroughs came. Kate's home on Colony Street was eventually demolished. The physical place where the crime had occurred no longer existed, but the case files remained, carefully preserved in the Albany Police Department's archives. Kate's murder had a long-lasting, devastating effect on her family. Her sisters struggled with grief and fear for the rest of their lives. Her nieces and nephews grew up with the shadow of her unsolved murder hanging over family gatherings. Sandy, who had discovered Kate's body at just 19 years old, carried that trauma with her for decades. The family never stopped hoping for answers, but as the years stretched into decades, hope began to fade. It seemed that Kate's killer would never be identified. The case continued to have a profound effect on members of the Albany Police Department as well, even decades after Kate's death. Veteran detectives who had worked the case early in their careers never forgot it. The brutality of the crime, the violation of an innocent woman in her own home, and the frustration of not being able to solve it haunted many of them long after they retired. Some would mention it to younger officers, describing it as the case that got away, the one they wished they could have solved. In August of 2018, more than half a century after Kate's murder, several retired Albany detectives attended a party together. These men had served together for years, and even in retirement, they stayed in touch and reminisced about their careers. That evening, the conversation turned to old cases, as it often did when investigators gathered. They began discussing cases that had really stuck with them over the years, the ones they still thought about, the ones that still bothered them. For many of them, it was the brutal murder of Kate Blackburn. They talked about the details of the case, the leads they had followed, the suspects they had investigated, and the frustration of never finding the killer. The case was 54 years old at that point, but it was still vivid in their memories. One of the detectives at that party was married to Melissa Morey, who at that time was a detective in the Albany Police Department's Forensic Investigation Bureau. When her husband came home from the party that evening, he told her about the conversation and the case the retired detectives had been discussing. Detective Morey had never heard of the Kate Blackburn case before, but as her husband described the details, she immediately became interested. Detective Morey knew from her position in the Forensic Investigation Bureau that evidence from cases even older than Kate's was still preserved and stored with the department. The Albany Police Department had always been meticulous about preserving evidence, even before modern forensic science made it clear how valuable decades-old evidence could become. She decided to look into what evidence from Kate's case was still available and what condition it was in. What she found was remarkable. A large amount of evidence was still in the department's possession, and the investigators in 1964 had collected it carefully and preserved it properly. They had followed the best practices of their time, carefully packaging and labeling everything, ensuring that it would remain stable over time. They may not have had the technology to fully analyze everything they collected, but they had the foresight to preserve it for future analysis. As Detective Morey reviewed the case files, she also learned that she personally knew someone named in those files, Kate's niece Sandy, who had discovered Kate's body that September morning in 1964. She realized with surprise that Sandy was their neighbor, a friendly woman who would compliment their dog while they were out walking it in the neighborhood. Detective Morey and her husband had chatted with Sandy many times, never knowing the tragedy she had experienced decades earlier. the detective did not immediately bring up the case with Sandy. She wanted to be sensitive to the fact that discussing it might upset her or bring back traumatic memories. She didn't want to raise false hopes about solving the case until she knew whether pursuing new forensic testing was actually feasible. Detective Morey began organizing the case files more thoroughly and making inquiries with forensic laboratories about the possibility of submitting some of the evidence for modern DNA testing. She researched which items would be most likely to yield useful results and what the costs might be. However, her efforts on the case were temporarily interrupted when she was promoted to sergeant and transferred to a new division within the department. The Kate Blackburn case was put on hold once again. Then, in November of 2018, something significant happened. The Cold Case Analysis Center was founded at the College of St. Rose in Albany. The center was established specifically to help law enforcement agencies investigate unsolved cases using new techniques, fresh perspectives, and the help of students and faculty. Local news covered the establishment of the center, explaining its mission and encouraging families of victims in unsolved cases to reach out. Kate's niece Sandy saw the coverage about the center on the local news. After 54 years of waiting for answers, she decided to reach out to see if they could help with her aunt's case. She contacted the Cold Case Analysis Center and told them about Kate's murder and the decades-long quest for justice. The center was very interested in the case and in turn contacted the Albany Police Department to coordinate their efforts. Since Sergeant Morey had recently been working on organizing the Kate Blackburn case files and had expressed strong interest in pursuing the case, she was assigned to investigate it in collaboration with the Cold Case Analysis Center. In 2019, Kate's case was featured in the second season of the Cold Case Analysis Center's podcast, Upstate Unsolved. The podcast episode detailed the facts of the case, the investigation up to that point, and the hope that modern forensic science might finally identify Kate's killer. The podcast was produced in hopes of identifying potential new witnesses who might remember something from 1964, generating public interest in the case and raising awareness that could lead to donations to fund expensive forensic testing. Over the next few years, various options for forensically re-examining the evidence in the case were explored. Sergeant Morey consulted with multiple forensic laboratories and experts in genetic genealogy to determine the best approach. The science of forensic genealogy had advanced dramatically in the previous few years. Cases that had seemed impossible to solve were being cracked by building family trees from DNA and narrowing down to suspects. However, this type of testing was extremely expensive, often costing tens of thousands of dollars. Police departments, especially those in smaller cities like Albany, didn't have that kind of money sitting around in their budgets for decades-old cases. Funding had to be found from other sources. Eventually, the best forensic option was identified, partnering with Othram Inc., a laboratory in Texas that specialized in advanced DNA testing and forensic genealogy. In 2023, the Albany Police Department received a grant from Season of Justice, a non-profit organization that provides funding to help solve cold cases through advanced forensic testing. The grant made it financially possible to move forward with the testing that could potentially identify Kate's killer. A handkerchief that had been found underneath Kate's body in 1964 was submitted to Othram for testing. The handkerchief had absorbed biological material from the crime scene, and investigators believed it likely contained DNA from the killer, possibly from seminal fluid or other bodily fluids. Othram used what is essentially a sterile wet vacuum system to extract DNA from the porous surface of the cloth. This specialized technique allowed them to recover genetic material that had been trapped in the fabric fibers for nearly 60 years. They then used forensic-grade genome sequencing to analyze the DNA and create a comprehensive genetic profile. The profile was submitted to the FBI so that genetic genealogy could be performed. Genetic genealogists began the painstaking process of building family trees by comparing the unknown killer's DNA profile to profiles in genealogy databases, where people had voluntarily uploaded their DNA to find relatives. The killer himself almost certainly hadn't uploaded his DNA anywhere, but his relatives might have. Over several months, the genealogists worked to identify distant genetic matches, build out family trees going back multiple generations, and then work forward through time to identify descendants. They were looking for the intersection of genetic matches, geographic location in Albany in 1964, and the right age range. This effort did ultimately identify a man who potentially was the individual whose DNA had been found at Kate's crime scene. The genetic genealogy had narrowed it down to one person with remarkable precision. However, there was a significant complication. The man had passed away in 1998, more than 2 decades earlier. He had been dead for 25 years. Police approached the man's surviving relatives to inform them of the situation. This was an incredibly difficult conversation to have, telling someone that their father, brother, or uncle might have been a brutal murderer. The family members were shocked and disturbed by the allegation, but they agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation. They provided DNA samples from themselves for comparison purposes, which would help confirm whether the genetic genealogy had identified the right family line. The family requested that their involvement in the case not be publicly discussed beyond the basic fact that they cooperated. They had done nothing wrong and had no knowledge of any crimes their relative might have committed decades before many of them were even born. Police agreed to respect their privacy as much as possible. The DNA comparisons from the surviving family members showed investigators that they were definitely on the right track. The genetic relationships matched what would be expected if the deceased man was indeed the source of the DNA from Kate's crime scene. But to be absolutely certain, to have definitive proof that would close the case conclusively, they needed a direct DNA sample from the man himself. That meant exhumation. The exhumation took place at Albany Rural Cemetery on September 15, 2025, 61 years and 1 day after Kate's body had been discovered by her niece Sandy. It was a somber process, undertaken with all the proper legal authorizations and with respect for the burial site. Forensic anthropologists and medical examiners carefully removed the casket and opened it. Even after more than 2 decades in the ground, bone material would still contain DNA that could be extracted and analyzed. Samples were taken from a femur bone and an arm bone, which tend to preserve DNA better than other skeletal remains. These samples were submitted for DNA testing. The wait for results felt interminable for everyone involved. The detectives who had worked so hard on the case, the Cold Case Analysis Center team who had advocated for it, and most of all, Kate's surviving family members who had waited more than 60 years for answers. When the results came back, they were definitive. The DNA from the exhumed remains was a match to the DNA found at the crime scene in Kate's apartment. After 61 years, Kate Blackburn's killer had finally been identified. On October 8, 2025, the Albany Police Department held a press conference to announce that they had solved the 1964 murder of Catherine Kate Blackburn. The room was packed with local media, members of the police department, representatives from the Cold Case Analysis Center, and most importantly, members of Kate's surviving family. Commander Melissa Morey, who had been promoted since she first became interested in the case back in 2018, stood at the podium. She explained that through advanced DNA testing, genetic genealogy, and the exhumation of the suspect's remains, they had conclusively identified Kate's killer as Joseph Nacowski. Joseph Nacowski was born in Albany in August of 1931, making him 33 years old at the time he murdered Kate Blackburn. There are no indications that he and Kate knew each other before he came to inquire about the apartment she was renting. He did not live in her neighborhood, did not work with her, and had no social connections to her. She was simply a random victim, a woman living alone who was renting an apartment, which gave him an opportunity to get inside her home. Commander Morey explained that Nacowski's criminal activity had begun long before he killed Kate, and had continued on for many years afterward. He was in and out of prison multiple times throughout his life. His criminal record painted a picture of a violent, dangerous man who posed a threat to women, particularly elderly women living alone. In 1973, 9 years after killing Kate, Nacowski was arrested in Schenectady, New York, for viciously attacking an elderly woman in the apartment where she lived alone. The similarities to Kate's case were striking. A woman living alone, an attack in her apartment, extreme violence. He was convicted of that attack and sentenced to prison. He was released from prison in 1980 after serving his sentence for the Schenectady attack. From 1980 until his death in 1998, he did not have further significant contact with police. Whether this meant he had stopped committing violent crimes or had simply gotten better at not being caught, no one could say for certain. Now that his involvement in Kate's murder had been confirmed, Commander Morey explained, his DNA profile was being uploaded to criminal DNA databases across the country in case he could be tied to any other unsolved cold cases. Given his pattern of attacking elderly women living alone, investigators believed it was possible there were other victims. Because Nacowski had been dead for 27 years by the time he was identified, there would be no arrest, no interrogation, no trial, and no sentencing. The case could not be prosecuted in the traditional sense. However, the identification of the killer still represented a form of justice and, most importantly, provided answers to Kate's family after more than 6 decades of questions. At the press conference, multiple members of Kate's surviving family stood together, some holding photographs of Kate from when she was alive. Several of her nieces spoke at the event, thanking everyone who had worked so tirelessly on the case and memorializing their beloved aunt. Marianne Samaro, one of Kate's nieces, stepped up to the microphone. Her voice was emotional but strong as she addressed the room.
My name is Marianne Samard, and I want to say to you, do you believe in miracles? Prayers are so powerful. I stand before you to say that our family received a miracle. Thank you. After 61 years, we now know who murdered Catherine Blackburn. Our Aunt Kate loved her faith, family, and friends. She was a daughter, sister, aunt, friend, and neighbor. She was a supervisor at the Mohawk Brush Company on Fuller Road in Albany. She was well respected and loved by her coworkers. On behalf of Catherine Blackburn, we would like to thank Commander Melissa Morey, Christina Lane and her interns, and most of all, the Albany Police Department for preserving all that they did for 61 years. Without your help, today would not be possible. So many worked diligently to solve this 61-year-old case. Catherine Blackburn, you are not forgotten.
Other family members spoke as well, each expressing their gratitude and their grief. They talked about what Kate had meant to them, how her murder had affected the family, and how they had never given up hope that someday they would know the truth. One of the speakers was Kate's niece, Sandy Carmichael, now in her early 80s. Sandy was the young woman who had discovered Kate's body when she was just 19 years old, walking up those stairs to the second-floor apartment and finding her beloved aunt lying dead on the floor. That image had haunted her for 61 years. Now, finally, she had some peace. In the weeks and months following the press conference, additional details about Joseph Nacowski's life and criminal history emerged. Detectives continued researching his background, trying to understand who he had been and whether he might be connected to other unsolved crimes. Nacowski had grown up in Albany and had been in trouble with the law from a relatively young age. His early arrests were for minor offenses, petty theft, disorderly conduct, trespassing, but they established a pattern of criminality and disregard for rules. As he got older, his crimes escalated in seriousness and violence. The fact that he targeted Kate specifically because she was a woman living alone who was renting an apartment fit a pattern that investigators now recognized. The 1973 attack in Schenectady on another elderly woman living alone in an apartment was almost certainly not a coincidence. Nacowski appeared to have a specific type of victim he preferred: vulnerable women, living alone, in apartments or rental situations where he might have an excuse to gain entry. Investigators began reviewing unsolved cases from the Albany area and surrounding regions dating from the 1950s through the 1990s, looking for similar attacks on women that might be attributable to Nacowski. His DNA profile has been entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database, where it can be compared against evidence from unsolved cases across the country. As of late 2025, Nacowski has not been definitively linked to any other homicides, but the investigation continues. It's possible that he committed other serious crimes that were never reported, or where the victim survived but never came forward, or where evidence was not preserved well enough for DNA comparison. For Kate's family, the identification of her killer brought a mixture of emotions. There was relief at finally knowing the truth after 61 years of wondering. There was satisfaction in knowing that Kate's case had been solved and her story had been told. There was gratitude toward the detectives, forensic experts, and cold case analysis center staff who had worked so hard to bring them answers. But there was also renewed grief, learning the details of what had been done to Kate, understanding the random brutality of it, knowing that she had suffered. It opened old wounds even as it provided closure. And there was frustration that Nacowski himself would never face justice in a courtroom, would never have to answer for what he did. would never spend a day in prison specifically for murdering Kate. Still, the family repeatedly expressed that simply knowing the truth mattered immensely. For more than 60 years, they had lived with questions. Who killed her? Why? Did she suffer? Was it someone she knew? Now they had answers to most of those questions, even if the answers were difficult to accept. While the identification of Joseph Nacowski as Kate's killer solved the fundamental mystery of who was responsible, several questions about the case remain unanswered and likely always will. The most significant unanswered question is, why did Nacowski kill Kate in such a brutal and ritualistic manner? The use of heated knives to burn patterns into her skin was extremely unusual and suggests some kind of psychological compulsion or fantasy. This wasn't a killing that happened in a moment of rage or panic. He spent hours in Kate's house, making multiple trips between floors, heating knives on her stove, carefully burning designs into her body. Detectives and forensic psychologists who have reviewed the case believe that Nacowski may have had specific violent fantasies that he acted out during the murder. The sexual assault of Kate's body after death, combined with the ritualistic mutilation, suggests someone with deeply disturbed thoughts about women and violence. But because he died in 1998 without ever being questioned about Kate's murder, the full explanation for his behavior will never be known. Killers like Joseph count on people to stay silent, for them to continue their lives freely, and not brought to justice for their terrible crimes. Show them that you aren't in that camp by typing "Killers must meet justice" in the comment section. Another lingering question is whether Nacowski specifically targeted Kate, or whether she was a random victim. Did he see the apartment advertisement in the newspaper and identify her as a potential target, a woman living alone? Or did he come across her house some other way? The fact that he used a false name and address when putting down the deposit suggests premeditation. He knew he was going to commit a crime and wanted to make sure he couldn't be traced. It's also unclear whether Nacowski initially intended to kill Kate, or if the murder was an escalation from some other crime he had planned. Some investigators theorize that he may have initially been thinking of robbing her, targeting the apartment rental situation as a way to gain access to her home and assess what valuables she might have. But once inside, he escalated to sexual violence and murder instead. The fact that very little was actually stolen from Kate's home, the only thing taken was the pages from her rent receipt book with his name on them, suggests that robbery wasn't really the goal. The theft of those pages shows he was thinking clearly enough to try to eliminate evidence, which contradicts the theory that the murder was an unplanned escalation. There's also the disturbing question of whether Kate was Nacowski's first victim. He was 33 years old when he killed her in 1964. It's statistically unlikely that someone commits their first violent crime at 33 in such an elaborate, ritualized manner. The level of violence and the specific nature of the attack suggest someone who had been thinking about these things for a long time, and possibly someone who had already killed before. Detectives have reviewed unsolved murders of women in the Albany area from the 1950s and early 1960s, looking for similarities. So far, no definitive connections have been made, but the investigation continues. If Nacowski's DNA is found to match evidence from another case, it could reveal that Kate was not his only murder victim. While the Albany Police Department ultimately deserves credit for solving Kate's case through persistent preservation of evidence and modern forensic techniques, there were some limitations in the original 1964 investigation that should be acknowledged. The forensic technology available in 1964 was extremely limited compared to what exists today. DNA profiling didn't exist at all. The structure of DNA had only been discovered a decade earlier, and the idea of using it to solve crimes was still decades away. Detectives in 1964 had to rely on fingerprints, witness testimony, confessions, and physical evidence like fibers or hair, which couldn't be analyzed with much precision. The one significant advantage the original investigators had was the ability to interview witnesses and suspects while memories were fresh and while people were still alive. By 2018, when the case was reopened seriously, many potential witnesses had died, and memories from 1964 had faded. Some people who might have seen something suspicious or remembered useful details were simply no longer around to ask. However, to the enormous credit of the detectives who worked the case in 1964, they carefully collected and preserved biological evidence from the crime scene, even though they couldn't fully analyze it at the time. They had the foresight to recognize that forensic science might advance in the future, and they wanted to make sure that evidence would be available if better techniques were developed. This foresight made the eventual solution of the case possible. If those detectives hadn't carefully preserved the handkerchief found under Kate's body, if they had lost or destroyed evidence over the years, Nacowski would never have been identified. The original investigators may not have been able to solve the case with 1964 technology, but they laid the groundwork for it to be solved 61 years later. Kate Blackburn's legacy lives on through her family and through the impact her case has had on forensic science and cold case investigation. For her family, Kate is remembered not as a murder victim, but as a beloved aunt, sister, and friend. They talk about her kindness, her strong work ethic, her devotion to her faith, and the quiet dignity with which she lived her life. They remember her as a woman who faced difficult circumstances, a failed marriage, having to keep her romantic relationship secret, financial challenges, with grace and resilience. Kate's case has also become an important example of how advances in forensic science can bring justice even decades after a crime. The use of genetic genealogy to identify Nacowski demonstrates the power of this relatively new technique. Since genetic genealogy began being used to solve cold cases around 2018, hundreds of cases across the country have been solved using these methods. Kate's case was not the first cold case solved through genetic genealogy, but it is one of the oldest, with 61 years passing between the crime and the identification of the killer. It demonstrates that no case is truly too old to solve if evidence has been preserved properly and if investigators are willing to pursue new techniques. The case has also become an important teaching tool for the Cold Case Analysis Center at the College of St. Rose. Students and interns who worked on the case learned about forensic techniques, investigative persistence, victim advocacy, and the importance of never giving up on justice. The center continues to use Kate's case as an example when working with families of other cold case victims. For the Albany Police Department, solving Kate's case after 61 years represented a significant achievement and a validation of their evidence preservation practices. It showed that the time and resources spent carefully maintaining old case files and evidence isn't wasted, that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. In the end, Joseph Nacowski died in 1998 without ever being held accountable for Kate Blackburn's murder. He lived 34 years after killing her, moving through life while Kate's family suffered without answers. He spent time in prison for other crimes, but never for the worst crime he committed. In that sense, he escaped justice during his lifetime. However, through the dedication of investigators who refused to forget Kate, through advances in forensic science, and through the love of a family who never stopped seeking the truth, Nacowski's secret was finally exposed. His name is now permanently associated with a brutal crime. The historical record has been corrected. Kate's family knows who killed her and why she died. The 61-year journey from crime to solution is a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of preserving evidence, and the hope that truth can eventually prevail even when decades have passed. Kate Blackburn has not been forgotten, and now finally her story has an ending. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.